Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Cathedra at Triumphant Christian Church, where Bishop Cynthia Gee West serves as senior pastor. Tonight, we welcome you to democracy at a crossroads, community, power, and the way forward. This is a nonpartisan civic conversation created to foster understanding, thoughtful dialogue, and informed civic engagement. This evening's conversation is convened by Bishop Cynthia Gee West, bringing together distinguished leaders to help us better understand the issues shaping our communities and our nation. Thank you for joining us. Please join me in welcoming tonight's moderator, Mr. Lamond Daniels. Mr. Daniels is an educator, licensed clinical social worker, and community leader who has dedicated more than 2 decades to public service and civic engagement. He currently serves as Chief of Staff to the Mayor of the City of Norwalk. Please welcome State Senator Sujata Gadkar-Wilcox. Senator Gadkar-Wilcox serves as Deputy Majority Leader of the Connecticut State Senate, representing the 22nd Senate District. She is also a professor of legal studies at Quinnipiac University, bringing both legislative leadership and academic expertise to today's conversation. Please welcome Attorney Vanessa Roberts Avery. Attorney Avery is the former United States Attorney for the District of Connecticut and currently a partner at McCarter & English. Throughout her distinguished legal career, she has championed justice, public integrity, and the rule of law. Please welcome Dr. Gayle Alberda. Dr. Alberda is an associate professor of politics and public administration at Fairfield University. Her work focuses on civic engagement, public policy, and strengthening democratic participation through research, education, and community dialogue.
Of elected officials, attorneys, or professors. Tonight, I want to underscore it belongs to all of us. And that's why tonight matters. I also want to share that this isn't about becoming more political. It's simply this: becoming more informed. Tonight, we're going to explore 4 simple questions. What's happening? What does it mean? And why should we matter? Why should it matter? And how do we become more informed as engaged citizens? So I am super honored to be joined by 3 distinguished individuals whose careers have been dedicated to public service, the law, and civic education. Each of them brings a unique perspective, and together they're going to help all of us better understand, no pressure, all of us understand the issues shaping our communities and our democracy. So my role is simple, just to guide the conversation. So with that, let's begin. So I had a chance to chat a little bit before, so let's just start opening up, and I'll start with the senator. The title is Democracy at a Crossroads. Crossroads. So just simply, Senator, before we get into the content, when you hear that phrase, what does that mean to you?
Thank you so much, Lamond. And I just wanted to thank everybody for putting this together. This is the most impressive presentation that I've been doing. I've been speaking a lot in the last couple of years, so this is so well organized and so well put together, and such an important conversation to have. Thank you very much, especially Bishop, for thinking about this and having this vision. So democracy at a crossroads is such a critical concept for me right now, because I think what we're seeing in government, and now I'm seeing it from the inside, having only been in the Senate for the past 2 years, is that people feel they're not getting heard. We have the highest levels of private equity investments in healthcare, in education. We have public financing that's collapsing around us because the Supreme Court is allowing that to happen. Gerrymandered districts, so districts that people don't feel like, well, my voice not really represented because most people here supported this other candidate and someone else got in office. How did that happen? Yeah. And these are things that have, by the way, high levels of bipartisan support. People don't want to see AI taking over everyone's life. But it's like these projects are still moving forward. And I think that's why we're at a crossroads. Yeah. Because now is the time. And I'm also really hopeful about that crossroads, because I think now is the time for the public to come out just like we're doing now. So thank you for being here to say we have to raise our voice, and we have to stop what's happening, special interests taking over our government, our education, our healthcare system, and really make it back to a concept of the public good. And really, the only entity that can do that is the public.
Great, thank you. So, Dr. Gayle, same thing. The theme tonight is democracy at a crossroads. What does that mean to you?
Okay, so not to give away a little bit of what I'm going to talk about, but for me, it's a moment of uncertainty, I think, is where we're at. And whether that uncertainty is because my voice doesn't matter, I don't feel represented, there's no political equality for me, this policy, I don't like it, it impacts me negatively, or vice versa. I think that for me is like one thing that I thought a lot about when I was thinking about the title, is that uncertainty. And one of the things that I'm going to get to in a little bit is history shows us that we've been here before, right? We've been in these uncertain moments. So what can we take from that and to shape our next steps forward? Awesome. So I think that's what it is for me.
Thank you so much. Attorney Avery, same thing. Democracy at a crossroads. What does that mean for you tonight?
Thank you, and obviously Senator and Professor have touched on a lot of themes that I agree with as well. I think if I would add something new, it would be, when I think about democracy being at a crossroads, I think about 250 years young, right? We are such a young nation. The Constitution, when it was created, did not have a lot of us in this room in mind in terms of individual rights. And let's just take a moment to let that sink in. And so to me, when I think about us being at a crossroads, it's what do we see as the future of this country in terms of the ideals of the Constitution, how much we have gained since 1776 to today. Understanding that it was over a century before women, there are a lot of women in this room, even had rights under the Constitution. Thinking really deeply about what it means to be an American 50, 100, 250 years from now. We are at that space right now, and we are in a position to really help craft it, because there are a lot of forces that may not want to see it continue to move in the direction that it's been moving. So that's the crossroad that I have at the front of my mind.
Great, thank you so much. So, Senator, we're going to start with you. Some of the things already started resonating. I mean, you mentioned Supreme Court. There's a lot going on there right now. in our Constitution, but to lay the foundation of our democracy, help us understand how the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution continue to shape many of the constitutional questions people are asking today.
Yeah, thank you. So you have two. One, I think it's really important to look at these historical documents, which, as Vanessa mentioned, are not perfect documents, but they have a framework that we realize now, as it's being challenged and dismantled, turns out to be something that actually helps us change over time and become more inclusive, whether we started there or not. Provisions like the Equal Protection Clause to make sure everybody is treated equally. Provisions like the Due Process Clause, so before you're deprived of your liberty, that there is some fair process in place. This is a framework that we can use and that we can build upon, and we realize, at least I've been teaching constitutional law since 2011 at Quinnipiac, and it's only in the last couple of years that I realized how fragile it really is. And maybe we should have realized that earlier, maybe I should have realized that earlier, but that's where we are. And that's why I always start with the documents. So you have with you, you should have a copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And these are two very, very different documents. And the one thing I want to highlight and emphasize is, to me, the Constitution is not abstract. People are like, we don't have time for talk about the Constitution. But in reality, what's happening right now is a dismantling of fundamental structures that were put in place to balance power, to make sure we didn't get to where we are, to make sure there was a fair process in place, that when you're accused of a crime, that the burden of proof is on the state and there's a very high burden set. There's a lot in this document that comes also from the perspective of the accused, because remember, the framers were challenging oppression. And so it's really important to think of, as particularly the 4th, 5th, 6th amendments to the Constitution, which we call collectively the constitutional criminal procedure, things like search and seizure, due process rights, trial rights. The reason that those are there is because of a healthy skepticism of government, that you never know if government is going to overreach and target you. So we better set up a system that, in case anybody is targeted, that the rules apply to everyone in the same way. And that's why I start with these documents, because there's a lot there. There's, of course, we've changed them over time. And let's start with the Declaration, because the Declaration of Independence is very different than the Constitution. It is a list of grievances. It's a document that we read in some communities throughout the United States every 4th of July, which is my birthday, actually, the 4th of July. And I want to tell the American story, too. I was born on the 4th of July to immigrant parents in Queens. And to me, that is not just an immigrant story, that's the American story. And I've mentioned that I've gotten comments like deport when I put out pictures of my family or Bollywood music or something. And that really bothers me, because people who feel like they can speak for the United States and don't even understand the values in the Constitution, the values that are there to protect our fundamental rights, that's what I think has to change. And so when we start with the Declaration of Independence, this may seem like a historical document, but what it is it's outlining a reason that we ought to be independent from an oppressive government. So when a government goes too far and it violates too many rights, we can break free from that. And it may seem historical, but let's look at some of the parallels. So here are some of the phrases, here are some of the grievances listed in the Declaration of Independence, and they're talking about King George. He has obstructed the administration of justice. What do we see today? We see efforts to pressure the Department of Justice, dismissing officials like inspectors general, and repeated attacks on the independence of the federal judiciary. So that seems very parallel to me. For cutting off our trade, that's another offense. What do we see today? The enactment of sweeping global tariffs, right? We're getting into trade wars and restrictive trade policies that are unilaterally set. These are not even approved by Congress, right? These are things that are just going forward unilaterally. He's endeavored to prevent the population of these states, so basically obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, immigration. Let's see, that parallels today. Lots of restrictions on immigration, unprecedented mass deportations without due process, and attempts to restrict birthright citizenship. Now, in case you don't know, the Supreme Court did did limit that, right? They did say that we do have birthright citizenship, and they stopped challenges to that. But it's not an entirely a success story, because that was a 6-3 decision.
That's right.
And I can't even understand how
That's
three
right.
justices could, were able to go along with sort of
that,
plans,
absolutely.
right, of ending birthright citizenship. So something that hasn't been challenged for decades, or if ever, really, it's never sort of lost a challenge. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. So what do we see today? Deployment of federal forces and the National Guard into U.S. cities to suppress protests, and that's against the objection of the state elected officials. So that's a huge problem, and I'll talk about it in a second when I talk about the Constitution. He's dissolved representative houses repeatedly. That's against King George, and what do we see today? Repeated attempts to bypass Congress, even though Congress is the branch that is supposed to, be responsible for spending. We have the executive sometimes stepping in to do that, so we have a number of violations here. And then finally, he's erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. Everyone remember Doge? Mm-hmm. I mean, I can't think of something more unconstitutional than Doge. No approval by Congress. You're just creating a branch of government that gets to have oversight over finances and start cutting funding that has no approval of Congress, right? These are all, not only are they violations and are they problems, this isn't a partisan debate. This, if we look at our document, right, we're seeing something that's unconstitutional, because the answer, by the way, to these grievances in the Declaration of Independence is the Constitution. Mm-hmm. The Constitution was written to help prevent us from getting back here, and what's really dangerous today is it looks like we're sliding there. So that's what we have to think about, is how do we stop that from happening? And that's why the Constitution is so important. It's also a common language we share. That's why it's not abstract for me. It's something where it's different when people say, oh, you're just saying that because you're a Democrat. And the Republicans will say this and the Democrats will say it. No, there are some things that perhaps we can put in the policy realm. How much money we're going to put into Social Security programs, how much the government should be doing to intervene in communities, how many asylees we let into the United States. These are policy questions. But what's not a policy question is whether or not we give due process to individuals who are claiming they might be tortured when they return to their country of origin. That's not only a mandate. We didn't just make that up. We signed the Refugee Convention. We have our own act, a Refugee Act, that mandates that the only thing that we do is to make sure we give a due process hearing, and we're not doing that. There's no debate about that. That's a constitutional violation. Restricting money that was given by Congress to say, oh, the money is for healthcare, but I'm putting like DEI, limits on it. What does that have to do with money that's going for healthcare, for research? You don't have the authorization as the president to do that. That's not debatable. That's unconstitutional. Executive agencies censoring speech because they don't like what somebody said. Another thing, that is just unconstitutional. So the reason I say that we should use this language is because there are some things that are not up for debate. They're not up for debate because they're part of this fundamental document, and that's why we should look at it. And I have a couple of minutes, and we can come back to this. Mm-hmm. But the thing that the Constitution does. So I urge you to read the document. It's complicated, but it's not in a way. It's a simple framework. We separated out powers. We created different branches of government. We have the legislative, Article 1. The most powerful branch is not supposed to be the president. The legislature, number 1, because the consent of the people, right? That's the elected branch, legislative branch. Then we have the executive branch, and then we have the judicial branch. Those 3 branches are supposed to be co-equal. They're supposed to check each other. They're not supposed to work together. They're supposed to work together, but not only to sort of trade favors, right? They're supposed to check each other and make sure there are limits of that power. And so we're seeing that slide a little bit today, and that's what's really important. So one of the things, I'll come back to this because if anyone has sort of specific questions about the Constitution itself. But one of the other things the Constitution does that's really important to keep in mind is the document you have in hand is our federal Constitution. But we also have state governments. So it gets a little complicated. You know, we have one federal government and lots of state governments. And between the two, which one do you think is supposed to have unlimited, more jurisdiction, more power? It's actually the state governments. The federal governments were just supposed to help us kind of come together as a country for defense, right, to protect overall, principles of general welfare. But it's really the state governments that have the default powers. So the constitutional challenge that we're seeing, for example, when we see ICE agents who are federal agents coming into Connecticut and violating Connecticut statutes, it's not just statutes. It's not just that we're like, oh, we don't like this. This is like a Democratic versus Republican thing. No, this is a constitutional question, because the question is, can a federal agent come into a state and violate the laws of the state with no accountability? And the answer is no. Because we have the powers in the Constitution under the 10th Amendment to protect the residents of our state. That's Connecticut's priority, is to protect the people, all of the residents of Connecticut. It's Connecticut's priority to do that. So that's why these constitutional questions become so fundamental today, because they're not just abstract. They're debates we're actually having in the Capitol. And one thing for me that's so positive is we're having them in public as well. So I'm so glad, and I look forward to this conversation and to more questions so that we can continue that conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you. So we're going to turn it over to Dr. Gayle. One of the most important ways citizens participate is through voting, and you shared that one of your favorite ways to introduce students to this topic is walking them through the history of voting in America. So I'm going to ask you to take us on this journey about this.
All right, so I'm going to pick this up from my comment earlier about being in this uncertain moment. And the more that I think about this moment that we're in, the more I realize it's really how we feel when history is being made, right? When we're actually living through history. We don't know how the story ends. We don't know what the history books will write. We simply know that we're living in this moment that's very uncertain. And so, like I tell my students, if we want to understand why democracy feels like we're at this crossroads, we need to kind of understand the history of voting, because I think that gives us a lot of insight. At its core, voting is the struggle over power, representation, and belonging. And one of the things that I love about studying elections and voting is that it constantly forces me to question my assumptions that most of us, myself included, don't even realize that we're making. We tend to think of voting as this universal democratic right, but that isn't how it has been viewed, or possibly is viewed. Okay, our democracy began as a system of selective membership. The U.S. was not originally designed as an inclusive democracy. The founders were indeed skeptical of mass participation, so voting was never envisioned as this universal right. It was reserved for those considered legitimate members of the political community. And those boundaries were not accidental. The founders had a very specific image in mind of who counted as legitimate citizens. They were independent, economically self-sufficient, invested in the community, and capable of exercising political judgment responsibly. In practice, we know this to mean white male property owners. Women, enslaved peoples, free blacks, Native Americans, immigrants, poor whites, all were excluded because they were viewed to varying degrees as dependent, vulnerable to influence, or insufficiently invested in the community to be trusted with such political power. So voting was not simply about participation, it was about membership. And that's a pretty different starting point than the democracy most of us have come to know today. If voting defines membership, then election rules, that's my baby, determines how that membership operates. Election rules don't emerge in a vacuum. They are one of the primary ways that societies define who belongs politically. And throughout U.S. history, we see that there are concerns about outsiders, newcomers, supposedly undeserving participants that have repeatedly shaped voting laws and who has access to political power. When we think of things like voter registration, absentee voting, ballot design, drawing those district boundaries, and other voting procedures, many of us see them simply as administrative choices. I did too, until I went to grad school and started researching elections. And so election rules are not just administrative details. They shape political power by determining whose voices are heard at the ballot box. The secret ballot is one of my favorite examples. For most of us, I think we can agree that the secret ballot is generally a good thing. But what's fascinating is why it was adopted. it was adopted under the adage of combating voter fraud, but it was also a legal measure to prevent illiterate voters, many of whom were poor whites, immigrants, and newly freed black citizens from voting. Reconstruction is another example. For the brief period after the Civil War, black Americans voted, held public office, and helped reshape state governments across the South. But that expansion was followed by organized backlash. Southern states developed increasingly sophisticated legal mechanisms to reduce the black vote while maintaining the appearance of lawful elections. Literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and white primaries were justified using the language of election integrity, voter competence, and good government. So the point here is that one of the most powerful forces shaping voting rights is this question of who belongs. And in my world, we call that nativism. Now, when I use this, I'm actually thinking about something much broader, kind of beyond immigration. I'm talking about the belief that some groups are just inherently more legitimate members of the political community than others, and that goes all the way back to the founding. And what makes nativism so important to our conversation about democracy and elections and where we're at today is that it's rarely presented as exclusion. It is almost always framed as things like protecting democracy, preserving election integrity, preventing voter fraud, or ensuring qualified participation. And these debates have never really disappeared. They've simply taken on a new form. Today, we see them emerge as debates over proof of citizenship requirements, mail-in voting, voter identification, voter registration, and even who has the authority to administer our elections. So the policies might be new, but the underlying question has been the same throughout history. Who gets to belong? So one of the very unique features of American elections is that we don't have one national system. Okay, states make up many of the rules, and oftentimes states will delegate that even further down to counties and localities. And as a result, we don't experience elections the same. Even within the same state, we don't experience elections the same. So your voting experience increasingly depends on where you reside in the United States. That is why, for me, moments like this really matter. Today, many of us here probably feel like we're in a moment of democratic backlash, or like we're trending backwards. For voting in particular, because again, we're debating these same questions about participation, representation, and who belongs that have surfaced honestly throughout our history. So whether history judges us as a moment of backlash remains to be seen, but what history can tell us is we've been here before. Previous generations have lived through moments where the future of American democracy felt uncertain. They didn't know how their story would end either. So yes, we are at a crossroads, and that crossroads requires choices, but not just from our elected officials, from us as voters, from our communities, really from all of us. So the most important thing that I think I can leave you here with tonight is 3 habits of citizenship that I think really matter right now with respect to voting. Okay, I'll put the preface on there. First, we must pay attention to state and local governments and their decisions that shape our daily lives. Many of the key decisions about representation, election laws, voting rights, district maps are all made much closer to home than Washington, D.C. Second, we have to remain engaged, even when that feels exhausting. So one of the biggest concerns that I have as a scholar is when citizens become convinced that their participation no longer matters. When citicism replaces engagement, when people, let me rephrase that, when people stop believing that institutions, that communities, that people are worth investing in, when people stop participating, democracy simply becomes weaker. And it's hard. I know many of us are exhausted. I'm right there with you, okay? But democracy is something that we both inherit, and it's something that we actively shape. And so that is why engagement matters. Every major expansion of voting rights in the United States occurred because people organized, challenged existing institutions, pursued litigation, changed the laws, and demanded a broader definition of who belongs in American democracy. So inclusion happened because people stayed engaged and continued to participate even when the outcome was uncertain. Third, and your final one, We must ask harder questions. When voting laws change, it's easy for us to jump to the questions of, oh, how does this help my party? Or how does this help my candidate, right? But I'm going to challenge you to ask, why did it pass? Who benefits? Who's left out? Does it strengthen democratic legitimacy over the long term? Will citizens across the political spectrum trust the electoral system after the election, regardless of the outcome? Those are the questions that I've learned to ask as a political scientist. And those are some of the questions I ask as a citizen, because debates about voting are never simply about voting. There are debates about who belongs, who participates, and ultimately, who holds political power. So for me, the history of voting is a story of uncertainty. Democratic progress doesn't happen automatically. Neither does democratic decline. There's always room for citizens to determine what comes next. The question is, in what direction do we go? That, to me, is the crossroads before us today. Every generation inherits questions about participation, representation, and belonging, and every generation decides how it will respond. So my question is, what version of American democracy do we wish to build? While history can't answer those questions for us, we can, and how we do is going to shape our path forward.
Wow, great, great, great. All right, Attorney Vanessa Roberts Avery, you're up. So we discussed the Constitution, voting history. Now let's bring the conversation to the community level. Attorney Avery, I want to bring the conversation down to the community level. Based on your experience, what are the questions and concerns you're hearing from communities as people prepare for the upcoming elections?
Thank you. Great question. And I want to start by referencing what you've already heard. So, you know, when we have a forum like this, especially with people giving up their evenings in the middle of summertime to come out and engage with us, I think about what do we want people to walk away with? What do we want you to be fed with? And you heard about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and if you didn't get copies of those, please make sure you do before you leave. We have copies enough for everyone. You heard about voting rights and what it means to be an engaged voter and citizen in that regard. And you know, what I'm hearing from the community a lot is, what can we do to stop the things that we are hearing about happening or experiencing, and how do we change the tide? What can I, individual person, do to change that? And I want us to think about power and empowerment, right? You heard the thread about each of us. If you are an American citizen, I like to say to people, there are no powerless bystanders if you are an American citizen, right? We are a nation by the people, for the people. Each of us has a right to stand up and be heard. You have a right not only to vote, but to serve, to apply for appointed positions, to run for elected office, whether at the state, local, or federal level. And these are very, very valuable things. A lot of times we don't necessarily understand what it means to be in those roles, but for the discretionary roles in our government, that's where the power is. That's where the rubber hits the road. And I want us to leave here maybe thinking about, if you're thinking about where can I best lead, thinking about putting yourself in a position to be in one of those roles, or encouraging someone you know who might have the qualifications to step up and do so. I had the great honor of serving as U.S. Attorney, as you heard from the introduction, and I served for the Department of Justice during the past 4 administrations. I started a long time ago during the Bush administration, working down in Washington, D.C., worked during the Obama administration as an attorney. I worked during the first Trump administration, and then during the Biden administration. And I will tell you that there are certain institutional norms that you saw pass through each of those changes in administration, whether it was a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. And when people ask the question of me, what's so different now? This current administration is doing things that are very, very atypical, very different. Some people would say extraordinarily different, and I wouldn't disagree with them, from what the prior institutional norms were. Things like the rule of law, respect for the courts, and this was already commented on, respect for decisions that the courts are making. If you disagree with a decision that the court makes, you appeal the decision. You don't attack the judges and the judge's family and the jurors. That is just completely inappropriate, and these are types of things that never happened before under prior administrations, or if they did, it was the rare case, it wasn't the norm. Things like making sure that you are appointing people who don't show up with conflicts of interest and other things that would make them unqualified and unfit for office, which is why we have appointment by the president, but then a Senate confirmation process to vet people and make sure that they are appropriate for those roles. We have a current administration that has now decided we're not going through that process, we're just going to put people in place and skip the process altogether. And so you have the courts now stepping up and pushing back in a lot of situations. But the question comes back to us as individuals. What can we do to stop these things from happening? When we see things happening from the administration in the immigration space, and you already talked about this, sending the National Guard into communities where people are protesting, or sending ICE agents out with manifestos to do certain things without the proper training, resulting in people losing their lives, people losing their limbs, people losing their liberty, and being accused of violating immigration laws, being in the country unlawfully, when it turns out they're actually Americans, having to suffer through those challenges, or people being deported, as was stated, without due process. That is just never the way we have done things under Republican or Democratic administrations. And I think it's important for us to not feel disempowered to do something. There are things that we can do. We can come to forums like this, educate ourselves, yes. We can certainly go and get formal education by sitting in classrooms with either one of these professors. But we can also make sure that we are doing our part to show up on election day, that we are doing our part, as I said, to make sure that we are thinking about, are there roles that I myself might hold to help make sure that the government, at least here in Connecticut, is doing things the right way? How do I make sure that I show up at the table when decisions are being made, when votes are being made at the legislative level? How do I make sure that my federal representatives in Congress understand the way that I want them to vote when they're down in Washington, D.C.? Those are all things that we are empowered to do now, and I hope that you are thinking about ways to do so as we approach the fall, we approach election season. Actually, we're approaching the primaries next month, and I hope that we are all planning to participate in that as well. I have some time left on my clock, but I'm happy to yield it so we could get into the Q&A.
Absolutely.
And get some conversation
Absolutely. Well, let's lift up some of these points, and we're going to just have a conversation, and we'll just take it. I'm here just to kind of help lead us and get us to the landing. Powerless. It's unconstitutional. Using legal mechanisms. It's atypical. But so what do we do then? You know, where do we start? We're saying the laws are being broken, but things are happening. Talk to us about this stuff, because it's mind-boggling what we're experiencing, but we're saying it's the Constitution. These are all rights. Let's start with you, Senator.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's a question that most people are asking right now, is what can we do? It feels like all these systems are getting, corrupted in a way that's that cannot be derailed right now. But the reality is, for me, there's so much more power in this room, in every community, than people, I think, realize, because all totalitarian governments or oppressive governments have toppled and have been pushed out by consistent social movements and sustained engagement by the public. And there was some research that came out about that, that you need, I forgot the percentage, but 3%. Yeah, you need 3% of the population actively engaging in peaceful, nonviolent, only 3% nonviolent, but sustained nonviolent movements, and that has always toppled authoritarian regimes. because it seems slow, which of course it is, because institutions have a lot of power, but every time they get pushed back, somebody who wants to sort of work and do whatever they want with absolute power will stop at nothing. So when they get stopped, that's a moment to reflect and say, how did that happen? And in the last couple of years, that has always happened because of public movements. Mm-hmm. It's always happened because of all those rallies that have come forward, all the op-eds that were written, all of the pressure that's even going on courts. And I think that's the real power. And things are happening slowly. And as things, as more and more people are sort of stepping forward, you're seeing a shift even in the legislature. You're seeing a shift even in members of political parties that weren't willing to come forward before, who are now saying, wait, maybe this is too much, maybe this is too much. And a lot of those times, those thresholds were crossed on constitutional lines. So if you remember when the Jimmy Kimmel situation happened, right, that was like I think one of the first times we saw Republican legislators, frankly, in coming forward to say, wait a minute, I don't know that was a good idea to pressure because of the First Amendment. And so that's why I say use the language of the Constitution, because it's a language we all share, and it's a bipartisan language. And it did help to have those legislators come out and say, let's not do that. And in fact, they pulled back. Mm-hmm. So I every time there's, that the administration is stopped from doing what is really unprecedented. I just want to point out, by the way, other administrations, of course, had constitutional violations. Under the Obama administration, there was a drone policy, for example, where you could assassinate American citizens in conflict abroad. That is of course unconstitutional, and it was a terrible policy, and we should say that openly, and we did, some of us at the time. But what's different now is it's unprecedented how many constitutional violations there are over and over and over again, repeatedly in the frequency, and it's such a frenzy, it's like you can't keep up with it. That's the difference. So it's not that, yes, there have been constitutional violations under every Democratic and Republican administration, probably, but the amount, the volume, the frequency is just different.
Anybody want to respond to that?
I'll pick up on that, actually, because I think the volume is really important. So I used to work in politics before I went to the dark side of academia. And one of the things that, so I tend to tune into like the odd political things, right, that most people probably don't think about. But I had heard or read somewhere, I can't remember, but Steve Bannon, who was Trump's advisor first term, mentioned that the best way to get what you need done that isn't going to be necessarily liked is to throw everything out there and constantly have people wondering, oh my, yeah, you flood it, right? And so you just flood it so that like your head is constantly on a swivel, because then you don't know what to do. It becomes paralyzing. And so one of the things that I think in that moment I took away from that as a strategist was like, oh, well, we'll just focus on one thing, right? So pick your one thing that you really is something you're passionate about, right? So for me, it's voting and ballot access and all this stuff. And so I would focus on that. Go be a poll worker. Bring your neighbor and go be a poll worker, right? We can't have elections where we have the ballots counted as they're intended if we don't have the folks to count them, right? We have over 1,300 electoral jurisdictions in the United States. We have 169 in Connecticut, right? Think about that, right? So we need folks to do that. You can write testimony to the legislator on anything coming up. I think the senator made a great point when she said state governments. For me, state and localities, they're the bread and butter. Yes, Congress is sexy. Federal politics is great, right? But the bread and butter is state and local politics, right? We have over 90,000 localities. Those are municipalities. That doesn't count your school districts, your library boards, your hospital districts, your counties, right? So there's lots of ways to get involved in that way. So I would say pick your thing, make public comment, go be a poll worker. Just don't let the crazy make your head spin.
Thank you. Going back to you, Gayle, and I'm going to address it to you, Vanessa, because one of the things that you said, and I'm actually to pick up your notes, language is important. And what resonated to me when we talk about language, language matters. So can you unpack, there were some phrases that you said that this is what they're saying, but this is what this really means.
Yes. So when I teach my class, War on Voting, I talk about the two things that we try and balance in an election. We want election integrity. We want to be able to believe at the end of the day, we casted our ballot, it was counted as intended, and then it was, recorded in the certified count, right? That is something that is really important. We want to make sure that there's no fraud, right? We want to make sure that we're confident in our election system. On the flip side, there is ballot access, right? And if we think of voting as this universal suffrage is one of the things, 5 criterias of a democratic society. We don't have universal suffrage in the United States. We think we do, but we don't. For one, felons can't vote. Okay, so we have to balance those two things. And a lot of times what happens is we either, it could be true, like when we adopted the secret ballot, yes, there was rampant voter fraud. People were buying votes. It was a party on election day. They would look at our election system and think, we're boring, okay? So yes, there was that going on. But at the same time, there also was a huge increase in immigration. It was one of the largest increases of immigrants in U.S. history, from Ireland, from Italy, from Poland, from Russia, okay, from Germany. And those folks weren't white, okay? And they didn't speak good English, if they spoke English at all. So they weren't invested in the community. They couldn't own property, right? And so part of that was, well, if we make a ballot that they can't read, then they can't vote, right? Same thing if we look at the stuff that came out of the Jim Crow South. It's the same thing. So language is really important. I often tell my students when we're studying election laws in cases is the language of the law can be neutral in its written form, but the application of the law cannot be, right? We can have disproportionate effects. Take the SAVE Act, right? SAVE Act, combating non-citizen voting. Okay. That upholds election integrity, but here's what else it does, right? Because of the documentation that you would need if that passed to vote, ladies in here, how many of y'all are married? Show of hands, come on, don't be shy, this is class, okay? How many of you took your husband's surname? Yeah, I won't see you at the ballot box if that passes, okay? Transgender people. If their assigned sex at birth does not match their assigned sex on their driver's license or passport, they can't vote. Young voters can't vote. The elderly can't vote. How many of you know somebody who was born and doesn't have a birth certificate because they had a home birth?
Wow.
Right? Our elderly in particular, okay? Those are the folks who are going to be left behind. There's over 21 million people anticipated not to be able to vote if the SAVE Act passes that can vote right now. Think about that. Okay, so the law can be neutral. It sounds great, right? But that's where I get into this idea of nativism and this idea of who the country should have belonged to and the fight to expand that and where we're at today. So I think that's where that becomes really important.
Vanessa,
and I think, just to build on that, I think what's important for everyone in here to understand is that there are debates right now about what she just said. So the people who are backing the SAVE Act, they know that it's going to disenfranchise all these people. This is not accidental, right? It's intentional. I'm going to claim that it's intentional. I don't know who the drafters of the act are or who all the supporters are, but if someone tells you that this is what's going to happen, these are all the people who would miss out on this valuable, one of the most important rights we have as citizens, right to vote, and they don't care and they're pushing it anyway. That tells me that that's their intent. Their intent is to disenfranchise all these people who would be impacted. And so we have to make sure that we show up and that we understand and appreciate that there may be people who intentionally set out to do these things, just like they did, she talked about the poll tax and literacy tests and all the things that were happening and that some of you have read about, some of you lived through. in the Jim Crow South, as an example, right, where they tried to disenfranchise black voters. All those things that were happening were not accidental. They were intentional. And you combat that by being intentional about showing up to make sure that they don't succeed, right? That we don't move backward and go to a place where people in this room who can vote today suddenly can't vote tomorrow because this so-called neutral act has been passed. I think it's very important for us to make sure that we're paying attention to those things. And sometimes you can get lost in watching the news coverage and, feel like people, the political representatives on television kind of talk over your head sometimes because they get excited and they start talking to each other and they're speaking a different language. But, just peeling back those layers down to their essence to make sure that we understand, okay, what does this mean for me or for the people in my community? Or even if it's not for people in your community, for people who you would advocate for because you feel like they should not be disenfranchised. What does it mean for them, and what can I do to help and to change that? Because as my dear friend in the back says all the time, there are more of us than there are of them. There are more people who want to see the democracy that we live in continue to move toward an inclusive path rather than one that disenfranchises people.
And let me just add one thing that, to both points that I brilliantly made, that, I think right now is the time that we have to push the counter narrative. So when you're in the community, you're having an experience and people are intentionally distorting that narrative, then now it's our responsibility collectively from the community to push back. So the same kind of narrative around ICE, for example, right? ICE has been operating in the state for a long time, also under the Obama administration, under the Trump administration, under the Biden administration, under the Bush administration. So this is not new. Why are we having these discussions now, though? Because the treatment by ICE is new. The violations of state law repeatedly are new. Those things are new, but the narrative. Exactly. The due process denials. But the narrative is, one party only cares about protecting criminals in the state. Well, the reality is that we already have a state statute that allows us to turn over information to ICE. We've been cooperating with ICE for a long time by choice. Right. When there's a case of somebody who's convicted of a violent crime, right? But the reality is the communities and the families that ICE is targeting, these are families trying to get from day to day. And when you're removing things like temporary protective status for our Haitian neighbors, for our Venezuelan neighbors, for our Syrian neighbors, right, which are the three biggest communities impacted now.
That just happened, right?
That just happened. I mean, Haiti is still at a level 4 security risk for kidnappings, assaults, gang violence. So you're going to send people back. You lifted the temporary protective status, and now what? I mean, it's just inhumane. And that's what we have to be telling that narrative more so that that narrative is out there. What happens to people who are deported? So we just sent them back to their death? We should have some accountability for that, right? That is not, those are not the values that we're talking about, these constitutional values that we want to represent or that we ever did represent. And so that's important, the counter narrative.
Can I piggyback real quick? One of the things that I think is really hard is we live in a state where we're kind of comfortable, right? Like a lot of the things we're talking about either are happening at the national level. I'm not saying there's not stuff going on in Connecticut. Lord knows there probably is, right? But what I am saying is we're not Georgia. We're not Florida. We're not Texas, right? And whether it's healthcare access, whether it is voting access, whether it's the mid-decade redistricting, right? I think in a way because we are in a state that has codified a lot of this stuff, right? And we can get a little bit kind of comfortable and complacent. So one of the challenges I think that we have too in a state like this is to think about what's going on outside of here too, especially if.
No, let's talk about that because there's Connecticut, there's the other 49 rather. Unpack that for us around because we do have some good things happening here, but just in the Supreme Court just ruled that Louisiana case. What does that mean for us? The redistricting, the gerrymandering, how does that all connect to what's happening? Help us understand the Connecticut lens compared to what's happening in DC. And while we may be in a good place, but doesn't mean it's forever. Just who's in office in the future can change things too. So talk to us about that. Who wants to jump in?
I'll kick it off since I opened this Pandora's box.
Absolutely.
So I think one of the things that like I'm constantly thinking about, right, is like I have friends who live in other states. I'm not a nutmegger. I'm a transplant. I came here from the Midwest, and I have been. I've been here for a decade. I think I'm official now, but I don't know. But like when I go back to visit my friends in these other places, the laws are so different, and like the things that they tell me about, like the safety nets, the access to healthcare, the ability for them to vote. Even like, for instance, we have early voting, right? You can go on a Saturday and go vote, right? Where some folks don't have that. They only can go on Tuesday, right? And that's much harder to do. So I don't want to say like, we have to like get on a bus and go to Texas and, you know, raise ruckus per se and you know, help with any protest. But I do think there are things that we need to kind of look outside of Connecticut to really understand that bigger picture. Like why I keep calling it mid-century, mid-decade redistricting. Well, people wanted seats. They didn't want to lose power, right? And if you draw the districts in a certain way, you can determine who has access to power. You can pack it, you can crack it. Either way, you get the outcome that you want, which is not equal representation, right? And knowing that is going on somewhere else, right, is impacting because that's going to shape Congress. That is our federal government.
And maybe being creative about strategies that can get around some of the gerrymandering / redistricting that's going on.
Can you tell people what that is? I don't want to assume people know.
Gerrymandering?
Redistricting, like the difference.
Yeah.
Redistricting, gerrymandering. Right.
So redistricting, every 10 years, we have a census, we count everybody, and then we allocate congressional seats out. Yeah, so your congressional districts, right? If you're in congressional district 1 versus 5, that's redistricted, and we do it with the state legislator too.
And then gerrymandering is?
Gerrymandering is shaping the district in a way that suits particular interests. So you can, right, if you do it along party lines, you can, redistricting is actually very complicated. You know, there's a lot of communities of interest that come together, but when you're like slicing, you know, Bridgeport, let's say, into like 5 different districts, and some of it goes to Stratford, and some of it goes to Fairfield, and some of it goes to Trumbull, and some of it, and it's like, well, why are you slicing it that way when you had enough to make just one district in Bridgeport, especially if the outcome would have been different. So when you do that, and it's like, if you, like now these pieces of, let's say, which is a heavily Democratic city, become, that's not the case for Bridgeport. I'm saying in case that happens, you know, now those people basically are disenfranchised, and you're overrepresenting the other vote because of the way you slice them up, and that's very intentional gerrymandering. And it's by the way, it's a problem that, you know, going outside of Connecticut too, that impacts everyone because both parties do it. Because nobody wants to give back power, right? Once you have power and you control the state legislature, once you're in power, that every 10 years by the Constitution, we have to do a census, and then the reason you have to draw the districts again is because the population changes, and these seats are based on population. So when the population changes, you do have to redraw the district lines, and that's when you get to play around with them. But guess what? Both parties do it because everybody wants to hold on to power, and that's the real problem is, can we get some kind of, now beyond Connecticut, this really requires a kind of federal law that will restrict gerrymandering, right? Except the court could do it if they were willing to step in and say this is problematic, but they have in the past, and now they're like, nope, it's fine, right? This is the problem. And the other thing is things like campaign finance reform, which say, even in Connecticut, once the Supreme Court says for all federal elections, no limits, essentially, right, on special interest money pouring into campaigns. From the minute that decision came out, Citizens United, if you see the amount of money that it's just an upward trajectory, right, of the amount of money that has gone into these aren't public campaigns anymore. You know, this is not representing the public voice. So but now the Supreme Court stepped in and said First Amendment, right? They said corporations have the right to contribute to whoever they want to, which is again a distortion of actual other principles in the Constitution. so that's where we're like, we have to have the public stepping up to really challenge the court to reconsider some of these things.
So we have about 10 minutes, and so we did receive some questions from those that registered online, so I'm going to just hit some of them. Information overload. With news, social media, and AI producing more information than anyone can reasonably process, what is one practical habit people can adopt to stay informed without becoming overwhelmed? Who wants to take that?
I'll take it. I'll start. One of the things that I do, and yes, I agree with whoever submitted the question, if they're in the audience, information overload for sure, especially on social media, because they have the algorithms that are designed to continue feeding you the same type of information repeatedly, or other types of information that you haven't thought about kind of popping up in your timeline. What I do is with news, and everybody should have a different strategy, right? There's news on television, there's news that you can read in your newspaper, and there's social media, and a lot of us have at least one social media profile we use. When I'm on social media, to allow myself to have time for all the other things that I need to do, I limit myself. 5 minutes, 10 minutes tops, because that term doom scrolling was created for a reason, because 2 hours later you find you're still on the page. So I limit myself. I go on and I look for specific things. I say, okay, I'm going to read 4 or 5 things that I like, that I feel compelled to click the like button on, and then I'm out of here. I get my news from reading, because that's what I like to do. If you don't like to read, that's fine. But what I do is, New York Times is one of my favorite publications, so I start my morning with New York Times. I read the headlines, I scroll through, because there are a lot of things that people put out there that they want you to read that you don't necessarily need to read. If there are 5 articles about our dear president, maybe not so dear, if there are 5 articles about him, I don't need to read all of them, because I probably can get the gist from the headline. So I look for other things that are going to be of interest to me, sometimes having absolutely nothing to do with politics. I would encourage you to do that, to not forget about the things that are most important to you. It may be something that you feel is completely separate and apart, something about, I don't know, kids singing in the choir, or something that warms your heart, that you feel is separate and apart from politics. But everything is tied to politics at some point. Everything needs you to step up and be empowered. But fuel your body, fuel your mind with the things that give you that passion, and that's what will, I think, keep most of us engaged. So those are my strategies. I try to find the things that give me joy, that give me the desire to do the work that I do, and stay in charge of what I'm feeding my brain, rather than letting some algorithm decide.
Right. Let me just throw another one in, so we want to. Some groups say the current administration's approach to law enforcement, immigration, and appointments crosses legal or ethical lines. Others say every new administration changes direction, and that's how elections are supposed to work. How can an ordinary person tell the difference between a normal shift in policy and something more serious?
That's a great question. And that's exactly why I say let's talk about the constitutional violations and then separate that out from policy questions. And I think that's what's different about this administration, is they have been, in an unprecedented manner, violating constitutional norms and actual black letter text in the Constitution, the rule of law. And that's why we talk about, that really we're undermining our entire system of law right now. So for example, if we talk about immigration, it isn't up to the state of Connecticut to decide how many asylees can come to Connecticut. It isn't up to the states, in fact, to decide that at all. That's the federal power. It is up to the executive. They have a lot of discretion in deciding numbers, let's say. But they don't have discretion in sending somebody back to a country where they have claimed they may face persecution. And you have to take that claim at face value. Now, are some of those claims not true? Sure. probably, but that's still entitled to a process because you cannot send some. That's a mandate. That is a constitutional mandate that we have, and so that's the difference. And that's why I say use that language, because it's important to say, okay, if we're going to have a policy debate, let's debate that, and that's fair for the parties to debate policy issues. But it's, again, there are some things that are beyond debate, and that's what's happening. And again, that's why these things that look like, oh, they're problematic, creating Doge, oh, well, isn't it good to have accountability? Yeah, of course it's good to have accountability, but not to have an institution that has no accountability to Congress. That's not how these institutions are created. Congress is the one that controls the money. So there's a lot there that we need to sort of make sure we're paying attention to when it comes to constitutional violations that are separate then. Should we have more accountability? Okay, yes, maybe we say we do more or do less, and we can debate what that looks like, but that doesn't mean we cannot, there is no debate on whether or not a president is allowed to create a department like Doge that can literally cut money from communities against the will of Congress. Right? Those things are not up for it. So that's how we should be drawing the lines.
Great. Here's another one. That's good. So what is one practical thing, as we begin to wrap up, what is one practical thing every person in this room can do to become more informed and engaged? Everyone answer this for me, please.
Well, I was going to add to Vanessa's point, it's hard to stay away from technology, and especially with AI, but being here, being in communities, having community conversations, like John does, in the community, to make sure that you're engaging. There's just something different about being in, face to face and actually joining an organization, being part of a forum. And I think that makes a huge difference, because you also, that when we say the sense of empowerment, sometimes the organizing of a protest is more important than who shows up to the protest, because you're empowering that group that's organizing the protest. And don't forget that. I'm a big admirer of John Dewey, who is an American pragmatist philosopher who talks about democracy as a process, not just an end in and of itself, right? Because democracy requires that people come out. Of course, people are working, and sometimes you're trying to support your family, so you can't do it all the time. But whatever it is you're able to do, if it's organize one protest, join, or be part of that, that process will be empowering. And of the 10 people that are there to organize the protest, and my friend Joy and I have done we've organized many events. Sometimes people show up, sometimes not a lot of people show up, but you know what? We keep doing that. And we pick up like 1 or 2 people to do the next event.
That's right.
Right? So that's really empowering.
One practical thing every person in this room can do to become more informed and engaged.
Serve. Public service, I think, is so super important. When I was starting out in my career, I started out in the private sector, didn't really appreciate the need for being a full-time public servant. And, I grew up in a church probably not very different from this one, with a family who believed very fiercely in service, community service, and serving the community. So I've always done it in my volunteer capacity on the side. But being a full-time public servant at the federal level, at the state level, being inside and understanding and appreciating the sacrifices that people give to make sure that we as citizens of this state and this country have what we need to move forward is just a powerful thing to experience. The government has so much power to do tremendous good. I still believe that, but we need good people to work in government. And what we are seeing at the federal level, especially right now, this expulsion of good, hardworking people who've dedicated decades of their lives to doing good work without good cause, in many cases, forcing people into either retirement situations or just cutting them off altogether. That is unprecedented. there's going to be a point when administration changes and we need to rebuild and we need people to step up. And I hope that as those vacancies happen and opportunities arise, that people will think about stepping up, but also thinking about stepping up at the state and municipal level as well and serving, whether it's in a full-time capacity or a part-time capacity, or volunteering as a poll worker, as was stated.
So like a true professor, I'm going to say there's an A, B, and a C to this. A, get uncomfortable. B, set your boundaries. And C, I'm going to piggyback off something Vanessa said earlier, find your hope core. So A, get uncomfortable. If we want to change democracy the way that it's heading right now, you need to get involved and get uncomfortable, right? This probably means for most of us doing more than voting, going to protesting, organize a protest, you know, posting things on social media, making a little video, whatever it is, right? Find that and get passionate about it, right? And get uncomfortable with it. Do what needs to be done. I mean, look back at history and look at what happened in order for us to be here, right? We have to get uncomfortable. The second thing would be set your boundaries. Whether that is boundaries online, whether that is boundaries with your family. My family and I are estranged because of a lot of this stuff. And I have no regrets, right? Good people, but not my people. It's okay to set that boundary, right? Especially if it's for your own physical or mental health. I think that's really important. And then your hope core. That's what my students call all the feel good like videos online, right? Like the cute cats and like whatever, they call it hope core. Find your hope core and just spend time reminding yourself that what you're fighting for, that's it, right? It's the ability to have hope core every day. Right? And you can't get so lost in the battle or the fight or the protesting or what have you, the news, that you forget what it is that you're hoping for.
Great. Yes. So our final reflection, ask you all to answer this in about 1 minute, and you can complete this sentence for me. If everyone, it's one of those, right? It's one of those normal moderator questions at the end. I think you'll like this one. If everyone leaves remembering one thing tonight, what would you hope that would be?
I hope it's that there's a lot of power in this room. There's a lot of power for us as a community to speak up, and now is the time. Because communities are coming together, people are mobilizing, and now is the time to speak up and have our voices heard. And the more we do that, the more we push back, and we will get back our democracy. So we'll do that collectively.
Vanessa, what would you hope for?
I think that people would, similarly, that everyone in this room would leave here with so much optimism for what the future holds. We're still in a very difficult time, and depending on how you look at it, in my opinion, difficult time in terms of what we are seeing coming in terms of policy and the impacts in our community. But we have the power to make change, and we don't have to wait until the presidential election. We don't even necessarily have to wait until the midterm elections. We can start today. And so I hope that everybody understands that and walks out of here feeling like, okay, there are things that I can do right now. And if you need follow-up with us, we'll make sure we leave some follow-up lists and information so you can start getting engaged as soon as tomorrow.
Awesome. Thank you.
So I'm going to again go Professor Ianno. You matter, right, is how I want to start that out. That would be how I would finish that sentence. Now, here's the reason for that. Democracy is not a spectator sport. That's one of my favorite quotes. I have it on my filing cabinet. It's a little magnet, right? You have to get involved to make democracy work for you, right? And that's why it's you're the answer to that sentence. And one of the other favorite quotes that I have in my office, also on a magnet on my filing cabinet that I make my students read, is a quote from Shirley Chisholm. If you don't have a seat at, and I'm going to not quote her directly, but if you don't have a seat at the table, bring your own chair. And I think especially today, that is powerful, right? I have been in situations, especially when I was in politics, as a younger lady, where I'm not saying I'm not young now, but back in the day, where it was like, oh, literally a senator would say to me, "You're cute, you can go sit down, let the men talk." And I'm like, oh, no, here's my chair, we're going, let's go, right? And so you have to be okay with that, right? So it's not a spectator sport. We need to get involved. If there's no place for you at the table, find a chair, bring it, and make your own seat. Or better yet, get your own table with your own people and challenge that table, right? Like,
Awesome. Can you keep the applause going and help me thank the distinguished panel? Thank you so much. Before we leave, I want to recognize Attorney Kim Bush. She was the lead organizer for tonight, and she's going to offer some final reflection.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. This is such an esteemed panel. Everyone here is an expert in their fields. It was such a privilege and an honor to work with you. We had so much fun when we were doing our planning sessions, and I was learning during those planning sessions, and I hope you all experienced the same learning that I did tonight. So just thank you again. I can't thank you enough. It was definitely a team effort. So thank you to Fadette McRae. Thank you to Calvin Sellers. Thank you to PJ Lucky, and of course, thank you to our moderator, Mr. Lamond Daniels.
Thank you.
And thank you to each of you who came and participated. These are very important, necessary conversations, so thank you so much for being here, for sharing it, inviting a friend. So appreciative to have you here. So give yourselves a round of applause. But most of all, I would like to thank the host for this evening. This was her vision. This presentation that you see here was her vision. I appreciate the grace and space to run with the vision. Please celebrate my bishop, Bishop West. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And at this time, it's my honor to invite our bishop to come forward for any closing remarks she would like to share. Our bishop.
Thank you so much. To our panel and to you, if we ever needed to come together, this is a good time to come together. This is a good time for us to lock arms, lock hands, go with all of your might, that our family not be pushed around, that our loved ones not be pushed around, and that we gain what is rightfully ours. You've got to gain it. And we're so grateful. I started to say we thank God. I am religious. But we thank our panel so much for sharing. But my prayer is, don't let this next generation have to suffer all of this prejudiceness. Do it because we're able to make a difference. God bless you.
Thank you so much. Have a good night. We appreciate you, and we're going to be doing more of these in our community. Have a great evening. Safe travels home. Thank you again. And thank you to our panel one more time.